Yeah, I think everyone is pretty well aware of the propaganda in line that China is colonizing Africa. I think it's one of the most like pedestrian talking points, but it is one that, as a member of the African People's Revolutionary Party, we have to be prepared to dispel and explain to people exactly why that is propaganda. Because even in law school, I hear this line every day. But I think it's important that we go over what colonialism actually is. And so I'm going to go on the Frantz Fanon note here, where he describes colonialism as a system of violent dispossession, which is depriving someone of land and property, and hyperexploitation. And as Frantz Fanon says, colonialism is violence. This is not because of simple racist feelings or rhetoric, but it is a system of resource extraction and economic exploitation that restructures the world into civilized nations and uncivilized savages. This rhetoric is actually one of the most important components of colonialism, and it's one of the ones that you don't necessarily truly see on the Chinese side today when you try to compare Chinese resource extraction with European resource extraction in the African context. Um, and this manifests in the way that we divide the world into the West and the third world slash the global South. Note that the world has already been divided into the West, or so-called first world, and the third world. Um, and so the relationship that exists between China and Africa, as we see, has steadily grown into the world consciousness, and it is at its peak for sure. But with this, there are different receptions, I guess, across the so-called international community, which is often full of Westerners, giving their opinions, and kind of applying them universally. Some would say this renewed interest in Africa by China is simply a new stage of colonialism, with the Chinese at the helm of the vast exploitation of African nation, as opposed to her former European administrators. This analysis, however poetic and moralistic, is uncompelling once viewed in the light of the material and complex reality of Chinese investment on the continent. It also lacks an understanding of not only Chinese political and economic priorities, but also African interests. So in order to do that, we have to look at the root of China's engagement with Africa. And I will be honest here, we're going to start the clock when the PRC itself was founded. Anything before that is not relevant to the current, uh, administration, I guess you could say, in China. So the history of PRC Africa relations goes back all the way to 1945. The notion that China has a sudden interest in Africa must be rejected on its premises, right? The founding of the People's Republic of China was hallmarked by its militant internationalism and hope in the revolutionary potential of the Third World. Out of 22 non-communist countries that established diplomatic relations with the PRC between 1958 and 1965, 17 of them were African. 14 sub-Saharan African nations established diplomatic ties with the PRC immediately following its independence. It is in revolutionary Guinea that China found one of its first close allies in Ahmed Sékou Touré, who is one of the founders of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And so between 1960 and 1969, a loan from the PRC financed the construction of Guinea's first oil processing factory, a bamboo processing center, a cigarette and match factory, a tea plantation, and more. We're going to see this trend as we look through Pan-African figures that I've listed here, into what exactly their priorities were when engaging with China and how similar they are to China's priorities on the continent even today. So I would say, right, and we're not going to do a full history session, but the true foundations of modern China's policy towards Africa actually lie in the often overlooked Bandung Conference. This is the ideological and political predecessor to the non-aligned movement. This is a convening of Afro-Asian cooperation, and it laid out the primacy of the struggle against colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism, and it opted out of Cold War bipolarity in favor of cooperative economic development. Big emphasis on cooperative economic development because that is basically the baseline of China-Africa relations in the PRC age. This is a lot, but we're going to go through it. So China aided and financed the construction of what is famous in Africa and known as the Tanzam Railway that connected the newly independent states of Tanzania and Zambia. And this construction effort resulted in a government revenue deficit of 1.2 billion RMB. And this is before pre-reform China. So China taking on this huge loan for the effort of showing solidarity to these newly independent African nations really does not explain itself well under a colonialist framework here. And of course, you can look more about the Tanzania Rally, but I think this might be a little too chunky for our purposes today. But I will end up by saying China's interests in partnership with African nations have been an essential foundation for the very principles of the PRC itself. In 1978, China supported aid programs in more African countries than the United States did. And understanding the historical basis for this relationship is crucial for contextualizing China's role in African development today. Next, we'll get on to Kwame Nkrumah in China, because when people talk about colonialism, they also mention neocolonialism when they talk about China's relationship with Africa today. But when you ask most of these people where they even get the term neocolonialism from, Kwame Nkrumah does not leave their mouth. Neither does John Paul Sartre, which, I mean, I'm okay with that. But they don't even know where they're sourcing the word colonialism from. And so the most recurrent critique that we hear that China's relationship constitutes neocolonialism doesn't even contend with the root of the term itself, which is in revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Obviously, Kwame Nkrumah is the other founder of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So it's good that we actually take his analysis, his approach to China, and his understanding of neocolonialism to actually look at the relationship today. So obviously, the analysis of neocolonialism did come from John Paul Sartre's colonialism and neocolonialism, but it actually gained its first true form and practical application at the All African People's Conference. And in its 1961 resolution on neocolonialism, Kwame Nkrumah basically takes that term and then writes his work, which is amazing. And if you can get your hands on a copy, you should. It's very expensive. Neocolonialism, the highest stage of imperialism. And this is meant to expound upon the theory of imperialism that is given by Vladimir Lenin. And just to go over neocolonialism very briefly, the essence of neocolonialism as a state is that in theory it is independent and has all the outward trappings of sovereignty, but in reality has an economic and political policy that is directed from the outside. So when people talk about Chinese neocolonialism, as in Chinese resource extraction from the African continent, they're just talking about colonialism. They don't even have the neo analysis added because they're just talking about resource extraction. They can't actually describe a way in which economic and political policy from an African standpoint is influenced by China in an internal sense. They can't name, Chinese corruption. They can't name that people are being forced to speak Chinese in the same way that Kwame Nkrumah is trying to characterize what exactly neocolonialism is and how that affects the African continent. He also says that the result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for exploitation rather than for the development of underdeveloped parts of the world. When we look at China today, 90% of its investment in Africa went towards critical infrastructure, as opposed to the structural adjustment approach favored by the West. And lastly, what is most important is understanding that it was in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana that China's Zhou Enlai laid out the 8 principles for China's aid to foreign countries that outlines China's commitment to the principle of equality and mutual benefit, of which China still operates on today. As Nkrumah states, the struggle against neocolonialism is not anti-developmental, and it's not aimed at excluding the flow of capital from the developed world from operating in the less developed countries. It is aimed at preventing the financial power in the developed countries from being used in a manner to further impoverish the less developed countries. When people talk about Chinese involvement on the continent today, it is a very anti-developmentalist standpoint that they take, and it is one that is contrary to the values of Pan-Africanism. I also got this quote from Zambia's former prime minister. His name was Kenneth Kaunda, and he remarked that every time there's a communication network between the African countries, that is a step nearer to the end of our continent's balkanization, on which imperialism has fattened itself. So if Africa's giants saw their relationship with the People's Republics and its principles of mutual benefit as a vital one for the struggle in neocolonialism, why can't we? If Kwame Nkrumah and Ahmed Sekou Toure saw that Chinese loans, saw that mutual benefit, saw that mutual economic cooperation was essential in their dealings with the PRC, why do we see the same relationships today, even though they're being made by African figures that we can all admit might still be neocolonial puppets? The nature of the relationship has not fundamentally changed. And so without firm grounding in the Pan-African and revolutionary groups' roots of the Chinese relationship with Africa, it's impossible to truly understand the significance and posture of this evolving partnership. The then Premier Zhou Enlai remarks bode well here when we're stating in reference to Chinese aid, it is not their intention to make them dependent on us, and that Africans would need to rely primarily on their own efforts to free themselves. An oversimplification based upon reference to European and American interactions with African nations ignores the most radical contributions made by African leaders who forged the path that the panda and the lion walk on today.